Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to this educational program, Secondary Sanctions, the Impact on Target Economies and Geostrategic Implications. Our hope is that this educational program will provide foreign correspondents who join us now virtually from different parts of the world with the opportunity to learn from our four well-known experts and gain a deeper understanding of secondary sanctions. So today we are going to discuss how secondary sanctions affect the target economy during these programs, looking at Russia, China, and Iran as examples. We will examine the effects, effectiveness, and side effects of recent US and also European Union sanctions on Russia. And first, I'm going to introduce our four guests, panelists, and after that, we're going to open the discussion for questions. This panel will also be available online right after this live interaction. I also would like to point out that this educational program is developed in partnership with the Hinrich Foundation, Advancing Sustainable Global Trade, highlighting that the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents in the US is solely responsible for the content of this educational program. I am Patrícia Vasconcellos. I'm a board member of the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents in the US, also US and White House correspondent of SBT, Brazilian TV Network. So I spoke a lot again. Welcome, everybody. Let me introduce very briefly our four panelists by an alphabetical order. Ali Nguyen, he's a senior analyst with Eurasia Group, Global Macro Geopolitics Practice. He's a David Rockefeller Fellow with the Trilateral Commission, a term member of the Council of Foreign Relations, and a Security Fellow with the Truman National Security Project. He also serves on foreign policy for America's Board of Directors. He's author of the new book, America's Great Power Opportunity, Revitalizing U.S. Foreign Policy to Meet the Challenges of Strategic Competition. From this year, this book. So thank you very much, Ali. Welcome. Our second guest is Agathe Devaré. Welcome, and thank you very much for being with us, Agathe. She's the Global Forecasting Director at the Economies Intelligence Unit, EIU. She's also the author of Backfire, an upcoming book discussing the global ripple effects of US sanctions and the steps that target countries are taking to insulate themselves from US penalties. Prior to joining the EIU, Agathe worked as an economic advisor for the diplomatic corps of the French Treasury, with postings in Russia and Middle East. Agathe also worked in investment banking in Russia and the US. She has a master's degree from Sciences, Paris, and Columbia University, where she studied as a Fulbright scholar. She speaks fluent French, English, Russian, Arabic, and Spanish. So thank you again. Our third guest, Bryce Barrows, welcome. He's the China Affairs Analyst at the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund. He previously served as an analyst at Caron Research in Sanctioned Actors and related commercial activities tied to the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, strategic trade control, supply chains, and human rights abuses in the Indo-Pacific. Prior to that, he attended at a long-term strategy group researching Sino-America strategy competition and the China-Britain Business Council researching Chinese market and tried for UK and also European Union companies. He's a Truman National Security Project Fellow, Aspen Security Foreign Scholar, and a Council of Foreign Relations term member. He's also an honorary graduate of the Republic of China, Taiwan, Military Academy. Bryce speaks Mandarin, Chinese, and Japanese, and spent more than 2 decades specializing in the Indo-Pacific region. Such a privilege to have all of you here, honestly. And our fourth guest is Fandir Batmanglish. He's the founder and CEO of the Boris and Bazaar Foundation, a think tank focused on economic diplomacy, economic development, and economic justice in the Middle East and also Central Asia. He has published peer-reviewed research on Iranian political economy, social history, and public health, as well as commentary on Iranian politics and economies. From 2021 last year to this year, Fandir was visiting fellow with Middle East and North Africa program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you very much, all of you. Ali at the beginning asked how we must start this, who is going to speak first. So we've just decided we are going to follow an alphabetical order with all of you, if it looks okay. Okay, so we are going to start with Agat, ladies first. So you are Global Forecasting Director at the Economic Intelligence Union, EIU. We know that you have few slides to share with us. And for our audience, Agat, please, if you could explain and highlight the side effects of the recent sanctions on Russia. A broad question, but I believe it's a very popular one. What is the impact of sanctions on the Russian economy? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patricia, and thank you very much for having me today. It's really an honor to be part of this panel with such distinguished speakers. So I'm going to share a few slides now, if that sounds okay to everyone, because hopefully it will help to discuss these very important questions. So hopefully you can all see my screen. Please let me know if you don't. Excellent. Thank you so much. That's the usual thing that we say when we do webinars. So I think that you asked a very, very important question, Patricia, about the effectiveness of Russia's sanctions, and that's exactly what I would like to talk about today. The two questions that I would like to address in this 10 minutes maximum, I promise. Intro remarks are going to be about the effectiveness of sanctions against Russia, because it's a question that I'm asked a lot in media interviews. So I assume that it would be of interest for the audience today. And then I would like to discuss a little bit the side effects, the global ripple effects of sanctions in general, because that's the topic of my book, which will be out in a few weeks now. And it's called Backfire, and it's precisely about the global ripple effects of US sanctions. So I thought that it would be interesting to start with the objectives of sanctions against Russia. And I think that here it's important to keep in mind that objectives vary across targeted states. But in the case of Russia, there's a first objective, which is about sending a signal. It's about filling the void between war and empty diplomatic declarations. So sanctions serve this signaling purpose. The second objective of recent sanctions against Russia are to complicate the financing of the war in Ukraine, because obviously if sanctions weigh on the Russian economy, it will make it harder for the Kremlin to finance the war in Ukraine. The third factor, and this is a factor that I'm sure Yar is going to talk about, is to put pressure on the Russian regime by fueling inflation and therefore hoping that there will be social discontent in Russia that will force the regime to change course in Ukraine. But in Russia's case, it may not work because Russia, well, is not a democracy, as we all know. And so avenues for the people in Russia to voice their discontent may be very limited. And finally, the fourth objective is really about a slow asphyxiation of the Russian economy in the long term. And I will say a few more words about this in a second, about what I mean here. What's the impact of sanctions on the Russian economy? There's been a lot of discussions about this. I think it's been very politicized as a topic lately. I'm French, and it's certainly a very politicized topic in France at the moment. Do sanctions against Russia work? Are they really having an effect on the Russian economy, or are we shooting ourselves in the foot? Well, I think if we take a look at the economic data that we have and that you can see on the graph on the right-hand side of the screen, it's clear that sanctions are having a huge impact on the Russian economy. If we take a look at the data, well, a lot of people would say the ruble has recouped its losses. Yes, but it's because of capital controls. Some people would say Russia is going to record a massive trade surplus this year. Yes, that's true, but it's because of a drop in imports. And all in all, the data point that we have point to a 6% recession this year and a 2%-ish recession next year, which is obviously really huge. Because if we put that into perspective, in 2014, when the first Western sanctions were imposed against Russia, Russia didn't even record a recession then, and only a small one in 2015. And I took a look at the data for Iran in 2012, when Iran was cut off from SWIFT. And at the time, the recession was about 4%. So if we take a historical perspective, 6% recession this year is really huge. And it will, well, be still very difficult next year, because next year the EU will ban Russian oil imports. So that is going to bite on the Russian economy. But I would say against Russia, the real objective of sanctions against Russia is the slow asphyxiation of the Russian economy, and especially the energy sector, because the 2014 vintage of sanctions against Russia prohibits the financing and the export of technology that is crucial for the Russian regime to explore and develop new gas and oil fields, especially in the Arctic. And this is critical for Russia because current energy fields are maturing, their reserves are being fast depleted. And so that means that developing new fields is crucial, but financing them and getting the required technology will be very difficult. And so what that means is that the real effectiveness of sanctions against Russia will be felt mostly in the long term. Will that change Putin's calculus? That's the key question if we assess the effectiveness of sanctions. So sure, we can see a lot of impact on the Russian economy, but at the moment, at least, what we are seeing, and this is perhaps due to the fact that Russia is not a democracy, so there are no avenues for people to voice their discontent with high inflation. Well, so far, no, it doesn't look like Putin's calculus is going to change anytime soon in Ukraine. And actually, if we take a look at what's been happening over the past 2 weeks, I would say there's been a very worrying escalation. We've seen mass, well, not mass, but mobilization of reservists. We've seen the Nord Stream explosion saga. We can go back to that in the Q&A. We've seen sham referenda in Ukraine. We've seen nuclear threats. So it's really clear that Moscow is not backpedaling. Instead, it is escalating. And so this begs the question of what more sanctions could be imposed against Russia, because there are discussions about this in the US and in the EU. And I would say there are 3 main options that are being discussed. The first one would be asset freezes on a portion of the Central Bank of Russia's reserves. That is to say, the portion that is held, say, in US dollars or in euro, in Western currencies. It could be used to finance the reconstruction of Ukraine, but in terms of international law, it would set a dangerous precedent because there is no legal basis to do that. So that's not really an option, I would say. The second option, and this gets much more interesting, is the imposition of US secondary sanctions on Russia, because so far there are no secondary sanctions. For instance, it's still legal for foreign businesses, non-US businesses, to buy Russian oil. But this could change, and this would be a scenario that would closely look like the scenario of sanctions that were imposed against Iran, and that had an impact on all businesses globally, because US sanctions theoretically only apply to US businesses, but when secondary sanctions are applied, then all businesses globally, all foreign businesses must abide by US law. But there would be a problem with that. There would be strong opposition from US allies. For instance, we know that India is buying a lot of Russian oil. So there would be a lot of tensions between the US and its allies. And finally, a cutoff from SWIFT. That's still a possibility. That's also a scenario that would closely resemble the scenario that happened with Iran. I was mentioning this in 2012. It would be much more realistic from 2023 when the EU is waning its dependency from Russian energy, because at the moment the EU still imports Russian oil because it depends on it for its economy to run. And I think that what this shows, when we take a look at these three options, is that powerful sanctions require international cooperation. And that's the problem when it comes to Russia, because we've done some research at the EIU showing that 2/3 of the world's population live in countries that are either neutral or Russia-leaning when it comes to the war in Ukraine. And obviously what this highlights is that Russia has very deep pockets of support globally, especially in emerging countries. And we can expect in the coming years and decades that China and Russia are going to try to tap into these pockets of support, for instance, in Africa, but also in Latin America and in Asia and emerging markets generally, well, to advance their interests. And all of this happens at a time when there is a gradual withdrawal of Western powers, such as the EU or the US, from these emerging markets. I was also covering vaccine inequalities during the COVID-19 pandemic, and there is a lot of resentment at the moment in developing countries against Western powers, and Russia and China are betting on this, capitalizing on this to advance their agenda. And so it is highly unlikely that there could be a united global front to impose sanctions against Russia anytime soon. And that is a key issue for the effectiveness of sanctions. What does that mean also in terms of side effects of US sanctions? Well, it's not only against Russia, and here we come to the idea of my book. I think that an aspect that has been understudied about sanctions are the ripple effects. What I mean by this is that I used to be a French Treasury official in Russia covering sanctions, and in the Middle East also covering sanctions. And what was clear to me at the time was that sanctions were having an impact not only on targets, but also on the population of these countries, but also on multinationals that were willing to operate in these countries, but also on relations between the US and its allies, also on commodities markets. And I think that's really important to take a look at these for US sanctions to remain a tool for US diplomats. And so there are two things that I wanted to mention here before I conclude. The first thing is that Russia is such a big commodities producer. Energy, gold, fertilizers, metals, base metals, precious metals, you name it, Russia exports it. Well, given the fact that sanctions look set to remain in place for many years to come, possibly decades to come, it's very hard to see an end to the war in Ukraine. Well, this will lead to a decoupling of Russia from global supply chains. Possibly some emerging countries will turn to Russia more, but Western countries will gradually probably turn away from doing business with Russia. And so we can expect a decoupling of Russia from the rest of the global economy. And so I know that we're going to discuss this in a second. Russia will have no alternative than to turn to China, of course, which will be, in Russia's eyes, the only alternative economic power it could turn to. But I'm sure that we're going to discuss this will be difficult. And finally, the other thing that I wanted to mention that I discuss in my book is that sanctions are also fueling the rise in techniques from targeted countries to circumvent sanctions, because there are such powerful tools that targeted countries are trying to find ways to circumvent sanctions. This can take many forms: currency swap agreements, for instance, to trade in local currencies, thereby not using the US dollar and not having what is called the US nexus. That would mean that trade is liable to US sanctions. It's also about alternative financial channels, such as China's CIPS, which is an alternative to SWIFT. It's far smaller, but still it's rising, it's growing. There are 1,200 banks that are connected to CIPS. And finally, also digital currencies, not cryptocurrencies, but digital currencies that are issued by central banks. For instance, in China, 400 million Chinese people use a digital yuan, and sanctions wouldn't apply to these financial channels at all, which is in the long term, and that's what I argue in my book, well, it means that the golden days of sanctions are over, because if we have this rise in financial channels that are completely sanctions proof, that are completely immune to Western scrutiny, well, it does beg the question of what the future of sanctions will be. I'll mention here very briefly, I love to chat. So if you would like to talk about these topics more, or if you're interested in my book, it's called Backfire. It will be out on November 15th. I do have some review copies available. So if you're interested in taking a look at the book, I would be delighted to chat or to organize this. Thank you very much for your attention.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Agathe Devahay, for all of your explanation. Well, one of the points that you just said here with us, it's about what are the alternatives for Russia, right? You just said it's going to be to look toward China. So I think it's a good way to introduce our next panelist, Ali Nguyen. Could you highlight for us, please, the idea of China? Is this country successful while trying to balance relations with China and with Russia, and at the same time with the West in the light of Western sanctions on Moscow? Welcome. Thank you very much for being here with us today.
Patrícia, thank you so much, and thank you for the generous invitation. It's a real honor and privilege to be among such august company. Just before getting started, I agree just 110% with everything, and I'm so glad that Agathe kicked us off. I think this really gave us a tour de force presentation. And I've been hearing, Agathe, I've been hearing a lot about your book. I think it really is going to be a seminal contribution. So I'm very much looking forward to getting my hands on a review copy and an actual copy and learning and sharing the word with everybody else. But I think it's going to be an incredibly important contribution. So I will, I don't have slides, unfortunately, but I'll keep my remarks brief. So I'll offer a few thoughts about how I think China might be recalibrating its relationship with Russia, or at least recalibrating its assessment of its relationship with Russia. And then I'll offer two additional points. One, how China broadly thinks about interdependence with the United States, with the West, how it's recalibrating that interdependence. And then lastly, to conclude, what kind of retaliatory apparatus China is putting in place in order to push back against sanctions from advanced industrial democracies, and also to signal to the international community that it's more capable of inflicting economic punishment on countries that cross it politically, and that it also brings to bear greater willingness to do so. So, I mean, first, a few comments on China's relationship with Russia. I can't take any credit for this formulation, but it's one that I invoke a lot because I think it's very compelling. Evan Medeiros has posited that China, vis-a-vis Russia, it faces what he calls a policy trilemma. And a policy trilemma in any context is you're trying to accomplish three objectives simultaneously, but it's very difficult to achieve all three of those objectives at the same time. So what is China's policy trilemma when it comes to Russia? Its first objective is that it wants to maintain at least its nominal commitment to upholding sovereignty and territorial integrity, which also extend, of course, to Ukraine. It wants to maintain its relationship with Russia because even though it is growing increasingly apprehensive about the course of the war, it views its entente, as Agathe was talking about in her presentation, it views its entente or its relationship or its partnership with Russia as an important bulwark against growing pressure from advanced industrial democracies. So goal number two is how do you maintain your relationship with Russia? And the third and final objective, which in many ways I think for China is going to be the most difficult, is how do you balance your relationship with Russia without doing irreparable damage to your relationships in the West? And there's a growing concern among Chinese officials, among Chinese international relations scholars, that it's going to be increasingly difficult to achieve that policy trilemma, because the longer this war drags on, and we've crossed the 7-month mark of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the longer this war drags on, and the longer that China at least publicly refrains from condemning Russian aggression, the more its relationships in the West are going to suffer. And you do have prominent Chinese foreign policy officials, prominent international relations scholars who express concern because they say, yes, our relationship with China, it is an important form of counterbalancing against growing pressure from advanced industrial democracies. But in the medium to long run, if you ask which relationships are going to be more decisive for China's long-term strategic outlook, its relationships in the West are going to be far more important than its relationship with Russia. And I think that a deepening relationship with Russia at best will only partially offset the impact on China's long-term strategic outlook of a continued erosion of its relationships with the West. So that's the conundrum that China faces vis-a-vis Russia. Now, my sense is that China didn't anticipate that it would have to confront this policy trilemma because we all recall, so if we rewind the clock, so Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th. We all remember a few weeks prior, on February 4th, China and Russia famously declared, they signed a joint statement, they issued a joint statement in which they famously declared that their partnership had no limits. I think it's becoming clear that the relationship indeed has quite sharp limits, and limits are becoming increasingly apparent. Obviously, only President Putin and President Xi and their respective top advisors were privy to the conversation that took place on February 4th when they issued that joint statement. My sense, I'm hypothesizing here, but I think that it's not a groundless hypothesis or supposition. My sense is that President Putin probably gave some indication to President Xi that Russia was going to conduct a military operation against Ukraine. And my sense is that President Xi probably thought one of two options. Option number one, that Russia was indeed just going to conduct what it called a special military operation, or option number two, that if Russia did launch a full-fledged invasion of Ukraine, that Kiev would capitulate so quickly that the West wouldn't even have time to mobilize a response. Obviously, the war hasn't gone that way. Again, it's crossing the 7-month, it's crossed the 7-month mark. The economic externalities of the war are growing more pronounced with every passing day. So disruptions to food markets, disruptions to energy markets, which are also weighing on China's economy. Those externalities are weighing on China's diplomatic relations. And it's not only that we don't see signs that the war, as we cross the 7-month mark, is winding to a close. As Agathe was saying in her presentation, it looks like Putin is doubling down. Putin is going to escalate. And so we may actually now be on the cusp of entering, in many ways, the real escalatory phase of the war. So I think that China is growing increasingly concerned about the impact of its relationship with Russia. It's trying to recalibrate. And I think that China, if you're China, you also have to be concerned by the speed with which the West was able to mobilize really, in many ways, historically unprecedented sanctions against Russia. You remember the narrative that Russia had cultivated. So after, and again, I keep invoking Agathe's just tour de force presentation because it contains so many points that I want to bring up and reinforce as well. Russia after 2014, the West did impose sanctions, but they didn't really have that much of a dissuasive effect on Russia, didn't really have that much of a crippling effect on the Russian economy. And in fact, Russia, after its incursion into Ukraine in 2014, its annexation of Crimea, up until its invasion of Ukraine this year, it had been touting for a long time its cultivation of a so-called fortress economy that would be steadily more and more impervious to external economic pressure. And I think that Western sanctions have really punctured that narrative. And even though, as Agathe mentioned in her presentation, it's true that by instituting capital controls and by leveraging high energy prices, Russia is temporarily blunting the impact of sanctions. But over the medium and long run, those sanctions are increasingly going to bite into Russia's ability to finance its long-term economic development. So if you're China, you have to be concerned about what implications that has for any aggression that you might be contemplating vis-a-vis Taiwan. And of course, I defer to my esteemed colleague Bryce, who is infinitely more knowledgeable about this topic than myself. But I think the one takeaway, if you're China, is if you're going to contemplate any aggression against Taiwan, one, you're going to have to do far more to achieve economic and technological self-reliance, so that if you engage in aggression against Taiwan, that in order to absorb the economic blowback that inevitably you will bring upon yourself, you're going to be far better prepared to absorb it. Russia, clearly, this narrative of a fortress economy, it broke down very quickly. And I think that China realizes that it has a long way to go to achieve economic and technological self-reliance. One last comment on China, Russia, and then I'll make a couple of other comments. Again, China isn't, I don't think that China is going to throw Russia under the bus, because it realizes that with the exception of its relationship with Russia, virtually all of China's major power relationships are severely more strained than today than they were prior to the onset of the coronavirus pandemic. So it doesn't want to jettison the diplomatic, military, economic leverage that a deeper entente with Russia confers upon China, but it does want to engage in a certain distancing. It does want to engage in a certain recalibration. And I think that we see evidence of this at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit that transpired just a couple of weeks ago. For me, it was incredibly telling, and not just for myself, I think for many others, it was incredibly telling that President Putin on September 15th, he said publicly that China has what he called questions and concerns about the conduct of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's inconceivable to me that President Putin, of his own volition, would admit that his principal diplomatic partner, his principal economic partner, had questions and concerns about the war, because it's an embarrassing admission for him. My hypothesis is that President Xi prevailed upon him privately and said, look, I don't want to embarrass you publicly. I don't want to humiliate you publicly, but China is increasingly concerned, and you need to at least somehow acknowledge our questions and concerns about the war. So China, it's all a way of saying that this policy trilemma I mentioned vis-a-vis Russia, it's going to become harder and harder for China to sustain. China is worried about the medium to long-term impact that this war is having on its relationships in the West. So even though it's not going to throw Russia under the bus, I think it is going to engage in some kind of recalibration. I want to make two other points and then pass the floor. The first is a kind of a broad comment about how China is recalibrating its views towards interdependence with the United States, and I think it's kind of an important point of context for our broader conversation about how China will respond to growing sanctions, export controls, economic pressure that manifests itself in many ways. I think that it's fair to say that up until the arrival of the Trump administration, when China looked at its interdependence with the United States, it didn't necessarily regard it as an unalloyed good. And obviously, interdependence, it does produce security vulnerabilities, it produces economic vulnerabilities. But I think, again, on balance, I think that China, up until the arrival of the Trump administration, saw it on balance that interdependence with the United States as being salutary. And I think it's fair to say that at least since the Asian currency crisis of 1997 and 1998, it's true that China had steadily been trying to wean itself off of Western stimulus. It had steadily been trying to cultivate greater economic reliance, greater technological self-reliance, but it wanted to maintain that baseline of interdependence. I think that with the arrival of the Trump administration, it really did begin reassessing its disposition towards interdependence. And there's one account, the journalist Bob Davis and Ling Wei, they have a book, a really good book called Superpower Showdown. And they talk about how China reacted to the Trump administration's imposition of its first tranche of tariffs in 2018. And they said that for China, that imposition was something of a Sputnik moment. And a Sputnik moment, of course, is when you have a dramatic realization that your national security is at stake. Some of your existential interests are at stake. And I think that China took with the imposition of tariffs in 2018, the application of the foreign direct product rule against Huawei, and various other forms of pressure that the Trump administration imposed, that achieving greater economic and technological self-reliance was no longer just an economic imperative, but also increasingly a national security imperative. And I think that there's a conviction now, if you look at some of the forthcoming measures that are going to be coming from the Biden administration, I think that there's a sense in China that growing economic pressure against China in terms of sanctions, secondary sanctions, export controls, that pressure is probably going to grow on a bipartisan basis. In DC, folks don't agree on much of anything, but I think that on a bipartisan basis, there is a growing conviction on applying economic pressure vis-a-vis China. So China increasingly views a recalibration of its interdependence with the United States, the cultivation of greater self-reliance as national security imperatives, because keep in mind, a critical part of the bargain that China's leadership has made with the Chinese public is, if you don't interfere, if you don't dissent actively, if you allow the Chinese Communist Party to steer the bus, we will deliver to you a sustained baseline of robust economic growth. But China recognizes that its medium to long-run growth outlook is increasingly strained. And this is not just because of zero COVID. I think that zero COVID is more of a short-term economic headwind for China, but in the medium to long run, a demographic outlook that's growing increasingly dim, a growth model that's running out of gas. You look at Xi Jinping's crackdown on major technology companies. So there are a number of factors that are collectively coalescing to strain China's growth outlook. And so China recognizes that given that confluence of macroeconomic headwinds and growing economic pressure from advanced industrial democracies, that achieving greater self-reliance economically and technologically, it's a growing economic and national security imperative. One last point, and then I'll stop. I think that what we see in terms of how China on its own is responding to growing pressure, sanctions pressure, and other forms of economic pressure from advanced industrial democracies, it's kind of putting in place, even though it hasn't really developed it in full, it hasn't really implemented it in full, but it's putting in place kind of the rudimentary foundations of what you might call a retaliatory sanctions apparatus or secondary sanctions apparatus. And I would point to three provisions in particular: the anti-foreign sanctions law, its export control law, and then China has now its, which I believe it debuted in late 2020, its own version of an unreliable entities list. And I think that what China is trying to do by putting in place this parallel kind of apparatus for responding to external pressure, one, it wants to mitigate the impact that secondary sanctions will have on its own economy, but it also wants to signal increasingly to companies that are doing business in China that, hey, If you heed US secondary sanctions, you might increasingly run afoul of Chinese sentiment. You might increasingly run into penalties from China. And so now, if you're a major multinational corporation with substantial operations in China, you now are caught in an increasingly vexing dilemma. You want to avoid incurring penalties from the United States, but you also want to avoid incurring penalties from China. So I think that going forward, one of the biggest challenges for multinational corporations with business in China is how do you deal simultaneously with US secondary sanctions, but also without incurring substantial losses imposed by China. And I think that China feels that it can put these provisions into place because it is economically becoming more central to the global economy. If you look at the latest estimates from the International Monetary Fund, China's economy already, it's roughly about 80% as large as that of the United States. So it's a major player in the global economy. It's a linchpin of global supply chains. It's the world's largest exporter. It's the world's largest trading country. So it's not only that China objectively is becoming more central to the global economy. I think that China also wants to gain traction for two parallel reinforcing narratives. The first narrative is that China is inexorably resurgent. And the second narrative is, according to China's leadership, that the United States is in terminal decline. The more that China can gain traction for those narratives, the more it will be able to convince countries, even countries that have substantial apprehensions about China's present conduct and long-term strategic ambitions, that they will in due course have to accommodate China. They'll have to make at least economic accommodations for China. And so I think that China will increasingly push back against sanctions, secondary sanctions, external economic pressure, not only by putting in place this parallel retaliatory apparatus, but also by trying to gain more and more traction for these narratives to convey to other countries that the writing is on the wall, the center of geoeconomic gravity is shifting towards China, and you'll have to accommodate us in due course. So with apologies for running over, I wanted to make those observations, but Agatha, again, thank you for just a real tour de force presentation that really laid the foundation for my own, and looking forward to learning from Yar and Bryce. Thanks very much. Oh, I think you're on mute, Patrícia.
Yeah.
Oh.
Now I'm okay. I just said thank you for everything you just said. So Bryce Barrows first, would you like to add anything that we just heard from Ali? And if you could please highlight for us the China effort to use primary, secondary, and comprehensive sanctions. Welcome.
Yeah, no, thank you everybody for allowing me to join. Once again, I'm very proud to be on such an esteemed panel. And I really welcome the comments that Agatha and Ali made earlier, many of which will touch on some of the things I will discuss. So about 2 months ago, I released a report on China's secondary sanctions against Lithuania with the Hinrich Foundation, as well as my team of the Alliance for Security and Democracy at the German Marshall Fund. And throughout this report, the whole purpose of it was to sort of look at what is China doing against Lithuania, and how is the European Union or allies of Lithuania responding to it, and what are the secondary sanctions, de facto secondary sanctions, that China is using against Lithuania, and as well as other EU member states. So I want to go back and sort of like take a little bit of a 10,000-foot view and define the different sort of three forms of sanctions that I'll be discussing. So as Agatha alluded to earlier, primary sanctions are those that are enacted by a country to restrict the dealings of individuals, entities, or foreign governments within the legal authority of that country that is enacting the sanctions. And it's always important to remember that primary sanctions are always, or usually rather, punitive in nature. The next form of sanctions after that are secondary sanctions, which are more of a form of deterrence to deter those same individuals, entities, and governments that are not directly subject to the legal authority of the country that imposed those primary sanctions by punishing third parties that engage in transactions. As Agatha alluded to earlier, this makes US secondary sanctions very powerful because the US dollar is a global reserve currency. So much of trade, even the purchase of Russian gas and other sort of things, especially related to Iran or other parts of the world or North Korea, has to be done in US dollars, which gives it a lot of bite. And lastly, comprehensive sanctions are generally speaking an embargo or holistic block of trade with a targeted country. And I think you can argue, given what China has done against Lithuania, they've used a combination of primary sanctions and comprehensive sanctions, as well as secondary sanctions against other registered companies within the European Union's single market. So Ali went ahead and listed these, but I'll just go ahead and rehash them out. China has 3 types of sanctions regulations. The entities list that Ali alluded to, the countering unjustified extraterritorial application of foreign legislation and other measures, as well as the anti-foreign sanctions law. I think what's really interesting when you're thinking about the evolution of sanctions for China in recent years is that historically economic coercion and the blocking of like goods and whatnot has been the way that China throws its economic heft around. But Lithuania, specifically as a test case, shows that China does have other means to really try to bring smaller and medium-sized countries to heel, especially those that might have closer ties financially and economically with China to do their bidding or attempt to. In Lithuania, the results have been a little bit mixed, but I can get into that a little bit later. So, as I mentioned, there's several actions that China is taking against Lithuania. And this includes downgrading relations with the country, imposing a total custom block on all trade from Lithuania to include blocking products that have Lithuanian-made components from other EU countries that have companies registered in, say, France or Germany or elsewhere. And this has had a very significant detrimental trade on Lithuania's effect on Lithuania's trade with Lithuania, China's trade with Lithuania rather, bringing down its trade relation and ties by 91% from 2020 to 2021. I think when you take this all together, it does show that China's trying to undermine the single market, and it is a threat to global trading in general. So I don't know if you could say that the effects of the secondary sanctions and primary sanctions against Lithuania have been necessarily effective. And the reason why I say that is ties between Lithuania continue to grow with Taiwan. And that's the whole purpose of why these secondary sanctions, primary sanctions, and comprehensive sanctions against Lithuania and other EU registered companies and entities have come into effect. That includes more trade delegations, more parliamentary what was the 16+1 economic framework with China between Central and Eastern European countries. So I think the fact that those issues continue to move on and those ties are deepening is a sign that these sanctions aren't having the effect that Beijing would want. Some of the countries that might be, excuse me, my connection, okay, sorry about that. Some of the countries that might be affected in the future include Estonia, Latvia, potentially Slovakia, Czechia, just given the ties that some of these places are having with Taiwan due to their response to the pandemic, and also a renewed sense of wanting to push back against authoritarianism, communism, what have you. And those imperial legacies and revanchist legacies that Russia has on those places, and how Taiwan's situation with the Chinese Communist Party brings up those similar sort of sentiments. I also think it's important to remember that this is not the first time that China has tried to target a particular country that is involved in the European single market. Norway with salmon exports is one notable example, noting that Norway is not a member of the EU, but uses the trade area that the European Union manages. So it's one example of where you've seen that China has done this before, although the Norwegian economy is a little bit more robust than some of the smaller economies I mentioned. And lastly, I want to discuss the European Union's anti-coercion instrument and whether or not it's needed, what is it. So I think it's important to remember that this instrument from European Commission defines economic coercion as seeking to pressure the European Union or a member state by making a particular policy choice by applying or threatening to apply measures that affect trade or investment against the European Union or a member state. And that includes import curbs, punitive tariffs, but also can include things that are gray zone, as Agatha mentioned previously, such as border and food safety checks or boycott diplomacy. I think a really good example of the last two would be China's ban of pineapples from Taiwan, and that fits squarely within that. But the ACI is designed to deter those effects, and it also seeks to countermeasure tariff concessions, import and export restrictions, as well as restrictions on banking, insurance, access to capital markets, and even down to visas. So it's very comprehensive. One of the issues that this piece of legislation has is, or regulations rather, is that the European Union members are still trying to figure out what will this look like in practice. But given the hastiness of the war in Ukraine, in addition to potential economic coercion or sanctions against other EU member states that could happen in the near future, there is a desire to want to hash this out sooner. Those are my comments, and thank you so much. I look forward to hearing what everyone else has to say.
Thank you, Bryce, so much. Now we're going to listen from Stefan Dier-Bachmann-Glich, who is going to focus with us on Russia and Iran. So if you could please highlight with us, please, especially in one point, if possible, how ordinary people suffer most with those sanctions. And thank you very much for being with us today. I know you have some slides to share with us too.
Thank you, Patricia. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
And it's full screen?
Yes, for me, yes.
Okay, great, excellent, thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm lucky because all the hard work has been done. But in some ways, I hope that my contributions can be a kind of summary and maybe a little bit of a sense of what the steps are for journalists who might want to cover and write about secondary sanctions. So I thought I'd put together some rules of thumb for reporting on secondary sanctions. We've talked a lot about the steps that countries take to impose sanctions, the effects that those countries expect to see in the targeted, the countries that have sanctions imposed on them. But I think the question for journalists is often, how do you actually try and figure out what's happening in the targeted economy? And my work has been focused on Iran for the last basically 10 years. And so it's been a big experiment in trying to understand the impact of sanctions on Iran and to cut through the noise. So the three rules of thumb are pretty simple. The first is that stagnation, economic stagnation, and not economic collapse should be considered the likeliest outcome when secondary sanctions are imposed on a significant economy. The second rule of thumb is that it's important to pay attention to imports and not just exports if we're looking at the impact of sanctions on trade. And Agat referred to some of the data on this with regards to what we should be looking at in Russia. The third rule of thumb is that it's important to focus on the power relations between state and society. And so this gets to Patricia's question about what are the kinds of impacts that are felt by people. So the first rule of thumb, stagnation is likelier than collapse. Why is that the case? Well, we know that secondary sanctions create a large exogenous shock on the targeted economy. So Agat mentioned that the Russian economy might contract around 6% this year. We've seen similar contractions in Iran in the two instances it was exposed to secondary sanctions. Once those secondary sanctions are in play, however, if the programs are broad, let's say they're sectoral and they really target many sectors of a country's economy, we could argue that most of the pressure that can be placed on the targeted country by the countries imposing sanctions has been maxed out. And so
I can see the first slide and someone just here did not the second. Yeah, okay. So sorry to interrupt, but
I'm glad you did. Can you see now?
Now we can see the first.
Okay, good.
Yes.
So Once the sanctions are in place, the targeted economy begins to adapt. Now, there's two reasons why that adaptation happens. The first is that economies are adaptable because of top-down policies. So this speaks to changes in, for example, the trade relations that a country's leadership might be prioritizing. Typically, what we see is that sanctions from the West lead to more economic dependence on countries in the global South, and particularly in terms of another superpower, dependence on China. But there are also bottom-up forces that I think tend to be overlooked. And it's worth considering, and we saw this in Iran in the last decade, that when businesses face the conditions of an economic recession, they try really hard not to go out of business. And this is especially true for small and medium enterprises, where we're really talking about business owners that feel responsible for their own family's livelihood, but also the livelihood of their employees. And so those companies at a sort of firm level start to find ways to try and survive given the economic headwinds. And the combination of these top-down and bottom-up forces means that generally after the initial shock of sanctions, a contraction of 1 to 2 years, we can expect that an economy will have a good chance of achieving some low levels of growth. And that's what we saw in Iran. So this is a chart from a forthcoming sort of report that I've been working on with Professor Mohammad Reza Farzanagan at the University of Marburg. It's basically, without getting into the technicalities, a way of illustrating what Iran would have achieved in terms of economic growth if sanctions had not been imposed in 2012 versus what Iran actually experienced. And you can see that there was a dramatic impact on Iran's economic development because of the secondary sanctions imposed on the financial and oil sectors in 2012. But there wasn't an economic collapse. I think what we can describe, if you look at the solid line, is that we have a period of economic stagnation. So this is what I would consider to be the likeliest outcome, despite the fact that officials often talk about the crumbling or crippled economy of the target country. Now, the second thing is what exactly are the harms that are taking place in different aspects of the economy? And what I would argue is that there's often a focus on exports. And this is because one of the political logics of sanctions is that we are imposing them in order to deny the target country's government revenues. And so officials tend to focus on the impact of sanctions on exports, principally energy exports, if we're talking about countries like Iran, Venezuela, Russia. But in cases where the target country is an industrialized economy, the imports, I would argue, are more important for 4 reasons. Manufacturing tends to be an equally large part of the economy compared to the energy sector in countries like Iran and Russia. Manufacturing jobs are a larger proportion of overall employment, so there's a connection to the welfare of ordinary people. What people consume in countries with a large manufacturing base tends to be domestically produced. So if there are impacts on output or on the cost of the goods that are being produced, that's a channel for the inflation that Agat mentioned. And then finally, when we talk about how countries adapt, it's much easier to adapt with regards to exports. You know, for a country like Russia or Iran, there are a lot of potential oil buyers. The question is their appetite to purchase that oil. But when it comes to key technologies and things like machinery, then there are a relatively smaller number of suppliers. You're having to buy from advanced economies, and that's where you really start to get the bottlenecks because of sanctions. So one way to kind of track this is to look at customs data for trade and to also focus on imports, not just exports. The other thing to look at is purchasing managers index data, which is it's a survey-based methodology for measuring economic output, and it can be tracked monthly. And basically, this chart shows you PMI data for Iran for the last few years. And what you'll see is that the blue line is basically all of the components of Purchasing Managers Index that go into the index. So it's things like sales, output, employment. Basically, companies are asked how they're doing on these different indices, and then the composite is Purchasing Managers Index. The red line is one index in particular, and that is the Raw Materials Inventory Index. And you can see that raw materials inventories has been the weak spot for the manufacturing sector in Iran for this entire period that Iran has been under secondary sanctions, because Iranian manufacturing firms have struggled to purchase the parts and equipment they need to maintain economic output, at least inexpensively. And that's something that has contributed to other economic phenomenon in Iran, such as inflation. So looking at imports is really key to knowing what's happening. Finally, Patrícia asked, what's the impact on people? And this is obviously a really important question because it gets at the possibility that sanctions are having humanitarian harms, and they often do, and that needs to be accounted for. But it also gets at the question of the political sort of goals that we have for sanctions, whether or not that's about affecting a policy change in the target country or affecting a change in the actual politics of the country or the leadership of the country. And what I would sort of emphasize here in the third rule of thumb is that it's important to look not just at whether sanctions are weakening the targeted state, but also whether sanctions are weakening the society in the targeted state and what the relative difference between the power in the two groups means for state-society relations. So what I'm suggesting here is that, at least in the case of Iran, but I think this is a generalizable case about countries that are under broad secondary sanctions, the state tends to be weakened, but society is further weakened. And so in relative terms, the state maintains its ability to dominate society. And as we see in Iran today with the protests that are taking place, there are real questions about whether mobilizations, really significant political participation by civil society, can impact policies in a country where these sorts of dynamics have been reinforced. So the last chart I'll show you, and this is from a forthcoming report by a visiting fellow at our foundation named Zep Kalb, is basically a chart that looks at the change in median household expenditures in Iran over the last decade, essentially. And you can see that the middle bar is the total sample. And essentially what this chart is showing you is that on average, the household consumption in Iran has fallen 20% in the last decade. And so if we're considering whether the Iranian state is in a weaker position vis-a-vis the kinds of forces that could influence its policies, I think the most important force being the public in the country itself, an economic outcome like this suggests that civil society has been significantly disempowered. So finally, the conclusion is that, sanctions are a legal tool. They target economic actors and activities, but they produce political and social effects. So journalists trying to cover this topic have a really difficult task. There's a lot of elements here. And I think in general, to cut through the noise, it's useful to have these kinds of rules of thumb. But I would introduce one caveat, and I know this is something Agathe and I have discussed before. Sanctions cases are different. And at the same time, even the cases that we have so far, we're still improving our understanding of what happened in those economies and those societies. And so these rules of thumb are actively being hypothesized and tested by policymakers, by academics, and I would say crucially by journalists. A lot of what we know about what to try and follow in a sanctioned economy is because of correspondents who've been reporting on the ground in the targeted country, and of course in places like Washington on the policies as they're implemented. So thank you so much for the opportunity, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Esfandiar. Now we already have some questions from our audience. What I would like to introduce is a topic that it's directly linked to one question that a person just sent to us. I believe that we must talk about the impact for the world of the decision announced yesterday by OPEC Plus of reducing the production and output by 2 million barrels a day. And it's linked to this question that we have from someone who is watching us. The person says, considering that sanctions may not achieve to erode Putin's ambitions to extend his sphere of influence into Europe and the right-wing liberation political swings in recent elections, and he says about Sweden, Italy, perhaps soon Denmark too, is dependence on imported fossil fuels going to finally erode democratic freedoms in Europe? And he concludes saying, Putin, along with Hungary and other anti-democratic forces, appear to be executing a hostile takeover of Europe, which erodes US influence. So any of you would like to comment? Agathe, maybe.
Yes, I'm very happy to comment. And again, I speak here as a French person. I spend a lot of time in Paris, and these are topics that obviously are very much discussed in France and Europe, the coming energy crunch. I think there are a few things here that are interesting to remember. The first thing is that despite all the talk about disunity, the European Union has been pretty united in its response against Russia, I would actually argue. Of course, there are divergences of opinion between some member states, such as France, that are advocating for tougher sanctions, and others, such as Hungary, for instance, that are advocating for less sanctions. But I would say overall that European unity, and this was also the case during Brexit, actually, has been pretty strong. Then the second thing that I would mention is actually, if we take a look at things with a broader lens, this winter and the coming winter, 2023-2024, are going to be very painful economically for the Eurozone. We're expecting a recession in 2023 in the Eurozone. There will be a lot of economic pain, especially for poorer households. But in the long run, what is going to happen is that Europe is going to wane itself from its dependency on Russian energy. And so if we take a look at things from a very broad lens, we could argue that this is possibly a very good thing, actually, because it means that Russian blackmail and strange explosions of Russian gas pipelines in the Baltic Sea, well, these won't have any impact anymore on the European Union. And I think that Russia has really established itself as a highly unreliable energy supplier. So I think that if we take this broader lens, we could argue that it's a positive thing, what is happening at the moment, lots of economic pain, but in the grand scheme of things, that may be a very positive shift for the European Union, importing more LNG from, say, the US, Qatar, Australia, also switching more to renewables, also doing some energy efficiency measures. So I think that if we take this lens, well, the situation is bad now, but it could actually be something good in the longer term.
Mm-hmm. Ali, Win, do you see like this as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this temporal dimension that Agathe introduced is extremely important. And so if you're Russia, you basically are thinking, how can I, given that over time, my coercive energy leverage is going to diminish, given that over the long term, my ability to inflict economic pain, particularly in my immediate vicinity in Europe, but also globally, is going to diminish, how can I maximize the amount of pain that I can inflict now? And so I think that for Russia, it's basically, in the next year, the next 2 years, what can I do economically with the energy leverage that I have? And as Agathe said, it is going to be painful. And I think that there's some observers who talk about the possibility that perhaps the world might enter a recession next year. So if you look at the endurance of inflation, if you look at the winter that the Eurozone is going to have, if you look at scar tissue from COVID-19, there's a coalescence of factors that may well lead the world into a recession next year. So I think next year, maybe 2024 even, will be quite difficult economically. But I think that Russia recognizes that its leverage over time economically it is going to diminish. And then that brings us back to the question that was asked about OPEC. Russia does have some escape hatches of sorts. And I think what we see with the OPEC decision, and you look at the White House's reaction to the White House criticizing OPEC for essentially aligning itself with Russia, and Russia touting its relationship with Saudi Arabia. So no, Russia is not a total pariah, certainly not. And I think particularly if you extend your aperture beyond, say, the G7, and if you look at, say, the G20 or the G77, Russia is not a pariah. But I think it's important even to sort of enter a caveat with that statement. And I again will come back to what I was saying earlier about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. Prior to the SCO, which took place last month, President Putin had been saying, well, the West response to Russian aggression, well, he wouldn't call it aggression, but that is what it is. The West response to Russian aggression, I had basically factored that in. I knew that the West was going to respond with sanctions. I knew that the West was going to respond by arming Ukraine. But up until the SCO, he had said, well, I don't need the West because look, I have my relationship with China, I have my relationship with India, I have my relationship with Saudi Arabia. Now, again, China and India, in many ways, they are continuing to deepen their relationship with Russia. But I think it's very notable that China and India, both in different ways, at the SCO, publicly distance themselves from Russian aggression. I think it's very notable that when Putin announced a partial mobilization, that China immediately called for a ceasefire. I'm sure Putin could have been happy. So if you're Putin, you're worried about the potential of furthering that distance, furthering China's distancing. You're worried about the potential of alienating India further. And India is actually very important. It's true that if you just take a snapshot, you say, well, India has this vast extant energy relationship with Russia. It has a vast extant arms relationship with Russia. But India can't dissolve those relationships overnight. But is India looking to change its direction of travel? Yes, because India is worried about Russia drifting further into China's embrace. India is worried about the impact of its relationship with Russia on its relations with other members of the Quad. So over time, India will want to reduce or diversify away from Russian energy and arms. So if you're Putin, you realize that you have a certain window in which to exercise this coercive energy leverage that you have, but that window is not, it's going to close in the relatively, or diminish substantially in the near future. And so I'll just make one last point. So I think, again, going back to this temporal dimension, I think that in the medium to long run, Russian aggression, I think it could induce or it could accelerate a move towards renewable energy sources. It could reduce Russia's energy leverage. But I do then worry about, as we enter this next potentially much more unpredictable escalatory phase of the war, I really do worry a lot about this next year or two. If Putin feels that he's diplomatically cornered, if he feels that his coercive energy leverage is going to diminish, will he use this narrow window of opportunity to engage in really escalatory, perhaps even inconceivable actions? And so I think that that's a danger that we need to be very vigilant.
Well, thank you. Well, we already have 1 hour of a panel. I'm going to drop here one more question. And so we're starting with Bryce. And if then Agat and also Ali would like to answer, I believe that it's Fundier is not here with us. So that's why both of you could add any comment after Bryce. A question that we have here is, for how long the world will see the US sanctions that comes also from the European Union, for how long, from your perspective, Bryce?
As in how long the sanctions will last?
No, for how long I believe that the question is for how long new sanctions will be imposed. This action and reaction.
So I can't speak on this as largely speaking, since I'm not a Russianist, but I do know a good amount about the way that the US formulates its sanctions policy, especially OFAC. I think what's interesting about what happened with the war in Ukraine is there are a lot of substantive critiques about the way that Treasury's sort of terrorism and financial intelligence sort of office umbrella and the different bureaus and offices that fall under it lack China expertise. And that's something that myself and other China hands have had for quite some time. I think the one area where they don't lack expertise is Russia. And I think that's because of Ukraine. That's because a lot of the individuals who have worked in that office or have been associated with that office very long were initially Sovietologists or studied Russia as undergrads and saw the Soviet Union collapse and whatnot. So I think what's really interesting about this conflict in terms of US sanctions against Russia, I do think that there could be new targets for a very long time because there's a lot of substantive knowledge and subject matter expertise within the US Treasury Department on different things that could be sanctioned that have not been sanctioned. I do worry about the long-term sort of blowback as to whether or not China or Russia with the assistance of China is able to find ways to sort of circumvent those sanctions. I think that's a real concern. But I think this sort of long-term implications of that is very muddled and unclear because we've had those fears before. And as we know with, the recent sort of like strength of the dollar against other currencies and whatnot, the dollar still remains a global reserve currency, still has a lot of weight to it, and continues to, even with individuals doubting it for years. So I think that the U.S. sanctions packages against Russia could last for a long time. I can't speak to the European Commission. What I can say is that at the onset of the war, at least based off my experience at German Marshall Fund, talking with colleagues that are based across the various sort of European capitals that we happen to have offices at, it was very interesting to watch European officials be several steps ahead of Americans, where the critique has always been the reverse. So when the war initially started, watching Brussels and the EU come together and say, we're going to do these sanctions, and then Treasury and OFAC have to catch up to what the EU is up to. Depending on how the war turns out, what new phases we might enter, I think we can continue to see that process, especially if the war continues to escalate, which is a possibility that Ali alluded to in the previous question.
Agate, during your presentation, if I'm not wrong, you said that the golden days of sanctions came to an end, or we already saw the golden days of sanctions. So keeping in the same thought, do you think that new sanctions are going to last for how long? And for how long we are going to feel the impacts of the sanctions that were already imposed? If you could develop that thought that you just introduced at the beginning, saying that the golden days of sanctions are over, right?
Sure. So what I was hinting at is something that I discuss in my book. It's the idea that targeted countries are increasingly sanctions proofing their economies. China is a prime example of this. Russia is doing that to Iran also. And also other countries are doing this, such as Turkey, for instance. And so this takes the form of building alternative financial channels, because the imposition of sanctions, the implementation is actually through the financial sector. It's really banks that are implementing sanctions. Actually, sanctions are usually called financial sanctions because it's up to banks to block transactions that are outlawed. And so if we have this rise in alternative financial channels, well, I don't think that the golden days of sanctions are completely over yet. I don't think this is going to be an on and off switch and that it's going to happen overnight. What I do think, however, is that this gradual rise of alternatives to Western financial channels and to Western currencies, such as the US dollar, are gradually going to erode the effectiveness of sanctions. And this is going to take a lot of time. It's not going to happen from one day to another. And it's really about the cumulative impact of, say, alternative financial channels, of, say, a bit less trade in US dollar, of, say, a bit less reserves held in US dollar or euro, of digital currencies appearing. None of these developments in itself would be enough to weaken the effectiveness of sanctions, but it's really the cumulative impact and the gradual impact that is going to have a lot of effects. And so what this means is that in 1 decade, 2 decades, especially as targeted countries, as Ali mentioned, are also drafting their sanctions laws themselves, well, we could find ourselves in a position whereby sanctions are not working as well as they used to be. And as I said in my presentation, sanctions fill the void between empty diplomatic declarations. And I say this as a former French diplomat. When you make a diplomatic declaration, it means you don't want to do anything or you can't really do anything. And war on the ground. And I personally see this as a dangerous development if sanctions are not available anymore, because I don't know what the alternative is. And I don't think there's an easy answer to that.
I'll keep with you. There is a journalist, a colleague here. He's also a member of the association, and he's asking for you. Do you see a possibility of China coming out to publicly condemn Putin for the war, since you said, oh, it's for Ali, sorry. The question is for Ali. So Ali, do you think that it's possible to China to condemn Putin publicity for the war, since you said China more than likely ranks its Western diplomatic relations higher than its relations with Russia?
Thanks, Patrícia. And just before answering that question, I think it, as Agathe was talking, it reminded me that Bloomberg published an article a few days ago, and I believe the Treasury is actually looking right now. The U.S. Treasury is specifically hiring someone essentially to work on sort of how to push back against sanctions proofing, because there is concern. There's concern about backfire. There's concern about a potentially diminishing efficacy of sanctions. So I think it's notable that that the U.S. Treasury is actually hiring someone who can help to improve the efficacy of U.S. sanctions, secondary sanctions. So it flows from Agat's presentation. In response to the question, Patrícia, that you just posed, my gut is that short of a really catastrophic escalation, and again, without diminishing, Russia has engaged in horrifying atrocities thus far. But what I mean is, short of a Russian deployment of, it's an seemingly inconceivable scenario, but we don't, I mean, who knows? There are many observers who didn't think that Russia would invade Ukraine. So we shouldn't rule out and say that Putin will definitively not escalate in this way. But I would say that short of Putin's authorizing the deployment of a tactical nuke, I think it's very unlikely that we see a kind of a public Chinese condemnation of Russian aggression, in part because such a public condemnation, it would not only strain China's one major power relationship that actually is providing a kind of bulwark against growing pressure from advanced industrial democracies. And as I said earlier, China doesn't want to throw Russia under the bus, even though it is increasingly concerned about the course of the war. But I think that kind of condemnation, I think that would also be embarrassing for China publicly. I mean, again, February 4th, so not even a year ago, China and Russia touting their allegedly no limits partnership. China and Russia, to many observers looked at that February 4th joint statement as essentially being an announcement that China and Russia were going to formalize and promulgate and establish this alternative authoritarian world order. I think it would be quite embarrassing for China having signed on to that joint statement on February 4th, alleging that its relationship with Russia was going from strength to strength. President Xi a few years ago saying that President Putin is my best friend. I think that it would be quite embarrassing for President Xi to have to backtrack, condemn Russia publicly. What I will say, though, is I would not be surprised if privately President Xi and his top advisors do begin to prevail more and more on President Putin and President Putin's top foreign policy advisors that you need to make a renewed diplomatic push. You need to build yourself an off-ramp. You need to think of ways of ending this, not out of a consideration for Russia's national interest, but out of a consideration for China's national interest. China is concerned about the impact of Russian aggression on China's economy. It's concerned about the impact of Russian aggression on China's relationships in the West. And so I would imagine that we will see more private pressure coming from China, not public condemnation, short of, I think, the deployment of a tactical nuclear nuke. One last sort of supposition that I would put forward, and then I'll stop, is it'll be very interesting to me to see what happens in terms of the conversation between the United States and China. It's very interesting. Prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the prevailing thrust of thinking in the United States had been, how do we prevail upon Russia to loosen its embrace of China? Now, as we approach the 8-month mark of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the thinking has reversed. And now the thrust of thinking on a bipartisan basis in the United States is, how do we prevail upon China to loosen its embrace of Russia? How do we prevail upon China to impose greater pressure on Russia? So I think it'll be very interesting in terms of a watch post, assuming that it looks like it'll happen, assuming that President Biden and President Xi indeed meet on the sidelines of the G20 summit taking place in Indonesia this November. I'm sure that Russia's invasion is going to come up in their conversation if they meet. I'll be very curious to see what the president and his top advisors say to their Chinese counterparts. Do they say that, look, the United States is concerned, China, you clearly are increasingly concerned about the course of the war. Maybe the United States and China can put our heads together and collectively prevail upon Russia to rein in its aggression. So I think that the Bali summit, the G20 summit in Bali will be a very interesting watch point.
Good to point out, yes, we have the G20 right here in November. Bryce, we would like to listen from you as it's related to China and this possibility of the same question, if you see something different, if you like to add something.
Yeah, so I think I just want to go ahead and echo Ali's comments. So I do think that it's been interesting to see the sort of reverse of China's sort of fortunes when it comes to a relationship with China. China's relationship with Russia, for a few different reasons. I think if you were to talk to many Chinese officials, sort of behind the scenes, it was very common to hear concerns about Russia expressed when it came to military might, or when it came to just being able to throw its sort of like heft around internationally, despite not having as large of an economy, but really being able to do that through, you know, having so many nuclear weapons, in addition to having a lot of oil. And I think now what you're going to start to see is more Chinese officials, or just more Chinese sort of entities and government entities as well, be willing to have a lot more heft in their relationship with Russia in a way that they might not even themselves feel as comfortable with. When this war kicked off, I had a conversation with a former commerce official who worked closely with the Chinese government for years, US commerce official. And the way that they described China and some of their policies towards Russia, but also the war in Ukraine, sort of typifies this as China can sometimes be like a cat that climbs up a tree and doesn't really know how to get down and know what to do. And what's really interesting about Ukraine is it puts China in this position where, okay, if China really wants to throw its weight around and become a superpower, part of being a superpower is you have to make hard decisions on issues like this. And it's very clear that they're still not fully there yet. And I think it's going to be interesting to watch, especially as Xi comes into his third term, whether or not that sort of heft grows and China feels more confident being able to embody being the more senior partner in its relationship with Russia under Putin, in addition to the growing amount of influence that China could have in the Russian Far East, as well as other things like, what sort of Chinese companies might get involved in business in Russia. And my guess would be mostly small to medium-sized enterprises. Similarly with financial institutions, mostly because they're not doing business in dollars, and they don't have as much exposure to the markets that the sanctions would affect them, like the pound, the euro, the yen, the US dollar, et cetera. So I think that's what's interesting to watch and to keep an eye out for, is whether or not China actually comes to embrace that it has a senior position against Russia, and how do Russian officials react to that, especially those in Putin's circle.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm gonna throw here the last question. So, and I believe that this question also can bring to an end or for a conclusion. The person asks for Agate. He says, as you pointed out, there are other financial options available now to Russia, and that raises the question about the effectiveness of sanctions. If the golden age of sanctions is over, what is the next best option to get Putin to stop his war? That's the question.
I don't know that there is an easy answer to this question. I think that's the problem at the moment, because obviously sanctions are having an impact on the Russian economy. They will have a long-term impact on the Russian economy, yet we only see escalation from Putin. And I think that if we want to explain this, and having lived in Russia, and I speak Russian, I have lots of contacts in Russia, I think that Putin does believe that he's fighting for his own survival, that the West is besieging Russia, and the West has bad intentions towards Russia. I do believe that he's convinced of this, which means that it is going to be very difficult to convince a man who is convinced that he's fighting for his own survival and the survival of his own country, wrongly, of course, but still he's convinced of this. I think it's going to be very difficult to make him change his mind. And the other thing that I would add is that there's been a lot of discussions about the fact that Putin's successor one day could be more open to Western countries, that everything could change. My view here would be that there has been a limited exodus of Russians out of Russia. We're talking about maybe 500,000 people. That's a lot, but there still are 140 million Russians. And all the indications that we have with limited data are that many of them are supporting the regime because of closed media, Russian propaganda. I mean, when every day you're being fed Russian propaganda that Russia is saving Ukrainians, in your view, this is absolutely wrong, but this is what Russians are being told. And so what this means is that we may have a long-term problem with Russia, with maybe several generations of Russians. And so it will take much more to fix this long-term issue than just having a regime change or just seeing an end to the war in Ukraine. I think this is going to be a huge problem in the very long term that we'll be talking about for a long time to come.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for your thoughts, your considerations. Agathe Devaret, thank you so much. Thank you also, Ali Wynn. Thank you again. Bryce Barrows, thank you so much. Also, Stéphane Dierbach-Manglish was here with us, joining this panel, this conversation. This panel is going to be available online very soon. This educational program is developed in partnership with Hinrich Foundation. We would like to highlight that the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents is solely responsible for the content of this educational program. So again, thank you very much. I also would like to thank all of the guests, journalists, and all people that were interested in hearing our chat, our conversation. Thank you again. Have a great day, all of you. Bye-bye.